That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Well, hello there and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. Oh, we've got a full program for you today, and that's in part due to the fact that the Idaho legislature is now in session. The governor just gave his State of the State address, and controversy. Oh, the controversy continues to swirl about us with a little bit of help from our friends in the corporate media. So before we go into any of these topics particularly, I want to introduce you to a phrase that could prove very helpful. Now, I hadn't even heard this phrase before just a couple of days ago. The phrase is constructed reality. It's from an essay by a writer by the name of Paul Rosenberg. And when he talks about constructed reality, he's talking about things, systems, and beliefs and arrangements that are imposed upon us, often against our will, as contrasted to things that we would organically, voluntarily, and willfully organize and come to ourselves. So I'm going to give you a few examples of what this looks like and then share some thoughts with you on what constructed reality, I'll show you the examples of what constructed reality looks like and then explain what it is that without all of these enforced groupings that are being forced on us, we would actually be working on for ourselves. So I'll explain the problem, but I also have a very solid solution to offer at the end. So if that makes sense, hopefully we'll go there first. Let's start with the governor's State of the State address. Yes, I didn't watch the video, but I did read the transcript. And, look, I mean no disrespect to Governor Little, but that was probably the single greatest collection of political platitudes I have ever seen in a while. I quit watching the State of the Union address years ago because I got tired of what Lou Rockwell used to call fascist jumping jacks, right? Where whichever party was in power, when the president would say what they liked, everybody would jump to their feet and applaud, and nobody wanted to be the last one clapping. And anyway, it's political showmanship. And Brad Little engaged in a fair amount of that. Now, to summarize what I consider his political showmanship, largely what he did was he painted this picture of, look at what a wonderful place Idaho is to live. Now, he's not wrong about that. There are many things that make this an incredible state in which to live, not the least of which is you can still find a greater measure of freedom here than you can in many other states. Now, having said that, he then assumed to himself, or at least he graciously took, as much credit as possible. Well, Idaho is a great place to live, and look at this. In these polls, people support what makes Idaho great. And then he set out to explain to us that what makes Idaho great is how he and his administration spend money. And boy, did he talk about spending money. As you can see here from the headline from Idaho Press, the Idaho governor calls for teacher and state police pay increases in the State of the State address. Over and over again, Governor Little gave the impression that, all these Idahoans are just sitting there on the edge of their seats, just excited like little children at Christmas time, waiting for Santa Claus to tell them what he's going to deliver for them. Now, if you happen to work within, one of the state agencies, whether you're a teacher or a police officer, state police officer, or a bureaucrat or whatever, or some kind of functionary, yes, that must be very exciting. But the presumption was, why, of course, everybody in the state of Idaho, including the taxpayers from whom this money was taken, must feel the same way. I'm gonna beg to differ. Thankfully, Wayne Hoffman from the Idaho Freedom Foundation took the governor to task, and you can check this out at idahofreedom.org. Wayne has a brilliant response to the governor's State of the State address, and look, you may think, well, he's just picking it apart, but this needed to be picked apart. You have a governor who's masquerading as a very conservative, small government advocate who gets up and then cheerleads for himself as a big spender and an expander of government and a person who takes care of those within the system. There was no doubt about that. Wayne points out that nowhere did Little mention or express an interest in doing anything about the cultural and economic crisis in our state and nation. This includes things like wokeism and the leftist agenda in the government education system, including here in Idaho, that are brainwashing and confusing impressionable students. He didn't talk about freeing students from failing government-run schools by offering real education freedom that empowers families by allowing them to choose school options that best suit their children. He didn't talk about an out-of-control government healthcare program that now serves about 1 in 4 Idahoans, bringing the state close to complete dependence on Washington, D.C. He never mentioned taxpayer funding of gender transition therapy for Medicaid recipients. He didn't talk about continued leftist indoctrination on Idaho's college and university campuses. No, but he took credit for a lot of great things, like people love to live here because we spend our money this way and we spend our money that way. I mean, that sounds like one of the most self-serving political speeches ever. Now, Wayne Hoffman went on to say, Little made it a point in his address to knock California Governor Gavin Newsom, but Little's speech was more or less a governing roadmap more favorable to folks who like Newsom than conservative heroes like Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. The governor's budget calls for hundreds of new employees, unprecedented raises for bureaucrats, corporate cronyism, and millions of dollars in new programs and spending. It's unaffordable, not conservative, and bad for the people of Idaho. Now, of course, the legislature is now in session. Part of what they're going to have to do is figure out how to spend all of this money. And this is something Wayne has weighed in on in a separate op-ed. Again, this is at idahofreedom.org, telling us that the legislature has one job each and every year. That's to spend the money they've taken, often unwillingly, from us. The least the governor and lawmakers could do is make the process more open, more deliberative, more engaging for the public, and not so slanted as to favor government agencies. He's right. And sometimes I think it's taken as a given that, well, of course, we need this funding, and without this funding, why we couldn't give you all the blessings that we want to shower upon you. That's kind of the mantra of the political class at every level of government. Look at the blessings that we are giving you. As citizens, we have to be wise enough to question, are these things that government should be involved in the first place? And if you're an advocate of limited government, it may be unpopular, but sometimes you have to say, no, that's not right. That's not what government should be doing at all. So with that in mind, let's talk about a couple of the particulars here that are being faced by the state. Now, Dorothy Moon, who is the head of the Idaho Republican Party, actually did a press release. She similarly called out the governor on his big government spending and big government advocacy, while at the same time he was claiming to be, a conservative Republican. And I look at this tweet from Heath Drusen, who is an expert on extremism. The far-right leader of the Idaho GOP continues to be an open rebellion against the state's Republican governor. Open rebellion for opposing this breach of principle here. He says it's not often you see the state party blast its own governor's state of the state. Bro, if the Idaho Republican Party, and I'm just going by its platform, if they really are a party that is advocating for limited government, then they are duty-bound to call out any leader, but especially the governor. If he's the titular head of, of state, and he's the highest, political office in the state, they should be calling him out if he is operating in violation of those principles. But, you have to know it's a far-right leader of the Idaho GOP government. It's a great attempt at spin. I actually called him out on this on Twitter, and Heath is like, I don't know. I can't see any spin. And of course not. Your paycheck depends on you not seeing it. But nonetheless, it's this kind of spin and support from the press, and the fact that Democrats were actually pretty gushing over Governor Little's budget and his State of the State address, that should be a clue to anybody who is concerned with having small government, limited spending, limited control over your life, and more fiscal responsibility. We can count on the media to advocate for bigger government every single time. And I don't know why that bias is there, but you point out the bias and they seem to get really offended about it. Now, that's one of the constructs, those constructed realities. Government is the solver of all problems, and government is the one that makes your life worthwhile. We're going to challenge that further in the program. Here's another headline that deserves your attention, since this is going to be a big issue in this year's legislative session, and that is school choice. The Idaho Business for Education's guest speaker came to town to denounce vouchers, outlining a destructive financial picture if school vouchers are implemented in Idaho. Apparently, this is a speaker from Indiana. And he said that, for example, vouchers create a lack of fiscal responsibility. Tell me if we've heard these arguments before. Choice increases the cost of education by spending general fund dollars on 3 school systems: private, religious, and public. Now, look, it does talk about in the Idaho Constitution about this money, this education has to be public, but it doesn't say government run. In other words, it just has to be for the public. But maybe another topic for another show. Listen to this claim. There is no oversight on how tax dollars are being used once they pass to private and religious schools. Really? They're not going to come with strings attached like every other thing that passes through the hands of the state? Please. Of course they will. It is not fiscally responsible for the state to directly subsidize private enterprises. Yeah. But we're going to show you some examples of where state dollars taken from the taxpayers actually are used in private hands and private decisions over and over. Last but not least, listen to this. Private and religious schools are private enterprises. Some are even nonprofit or either for-profit, rather, private schools. Idaho has 5 for-profit private schools and the rest are nonprofit. So the lack of fiscal responsibility, the lack of accountability, what are we going to see? What's going to happen? Those private organizations have far greater accountability simply because parents can choose to take their children out and take their money elsewhere. That is far greater incentive than an organization or an entity which takes money from the taxpayers, literally by threatening them, you will pay this tax or else men with badges and guns will come and hurt you. And mostly everybody accepts that's normal. That's good. Yeah, that's a constructed reality we're supposed to believe. So they don't have a choice. And if the school system just hypothetically doesn't deliver on those promises, let's just say, for instance, that school reading scores and math scores are below what they should be, even though more and more money has been pumped in continually, you're not getting the bang for your buck. Do you have the option of saying, I want to go to another system or I want to have choice? No. The only choice that advocates like IBE is offering is they want you to choose within the system, which is what, again, the cronies of the teachers unions and the education establishment and the education bureaucracy, let's keep this all under the state's auspices. Isn't it curious how that works out? As long as you don't have a choice, well, everything's just great, and we just need to put more money into it. By the way, give us more money. It's a very convenient arrangement. So Corey DeAngelis, who is one of the leading advocates for school choice, points out public dollars that can be used at private institutions include things like Pell Grants, the GI Bill, Iowa Tuition Grant, Iowa Statewide Voluntary Preschool Program, Head Start, food stamps, WIC, Medicaid, Medicare, Section 8, Social Security. So if we're clutching our pearls a little too tightly over the idea that, how could we have choice in education? This is going to destroy these schools. I'm telling you, there are other points of view that you should probably take into consideration before the doom saying of those who say that the only way that a child can really be educated and the only way that it's really going to take care of as many people as possible is if the state's administering it. That, too, is a constructed, meaning a false reality. If you can step outside that constructed reality, you would find that people are very innovative and able to come up with solutions that work. It's happening in other states. It's time for it to happen here. Why doesn't the media ever take an advocacy for those who want to try choice? Well, there's bias. And if you call out that bias, you tell them the media is lying, this is the response you're going to get. Source. If they were lying, they would tell us about it. Or if the government was up to something that they shouldn't be, they would tell us about it. Yeah. Are you starting to get the picture of how constructed reality starts to affect us? Look at this headline. Proposed LGBTQ rights policy causes fracas at Caldwell School Board meeting. This was a very interesting story in that the Caldwell School Board was looking very closely at a change to its district policy. And this is framed, this is part of that media bias that I'm telling you about, framing it as LGBTQ rights. Look, we either all have the same rights or we don't. You start trying to divvy them up into group rights, special interest rights. They're not rights. Those are state-granted privileges, and in some cases, preferential treatment by the state. But they don't want to call it that. So this is just a quick excerpt. I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but the Caldwell School District Board of Trustees believes in fostering an educational environment that is safe and free of discrimination for all students, regardless of sexual orientation. And from here, they go on and they start to describe sexual orientation shall mean this. Gender identity, look at this, shall refer to a person's internal sense of their own gender. And they go through all these woke definitions that they are appealing to in order to change their policy. They talk about in the case of minors, how do we do this either with or without parental consent? Can a student just simply meet with someone who is a representative from the district? Can we come up with a plan as to how to best meet the needs of these children? This is all this transgender, woke, gender identity stuff that we're told is not being taught or otherwise being introduced into our school system. Well, here it is. Here is why so many parents, though, showed up at that Caldwell School Board meeting. Based on the plan, students may use the restrooms and locker rooms that correspond to the gender identity they consistently express at school. No student will be required to use facilities that conflict with his or her gender identity consistently expressed at school. So let's just be blunt about what that means. That means that, yes, children who were born with the male body will be able to freely use the girls' locker room and the girls' restroom if they express themselves as such at school. Now, look, I just have to say this. People struggle with different mental health issues in a number of different ways. This is simply a mental health issue. This doesn't mean that they're deserving of condemnation. It doesn't mean that they're deserving of shame. Nor does it mean that the rest of us need to be drafted into that child's fantasy and that the rest of the world should suddenly start to orbit around them as if they are the center of the universe. What about those parents who were not happy about the idea of, wait a minute, there are going to be boys, people who were born boys, using the same restroom, the same locker room as my daughter, and that's just supposed to be okay? Now, maybe you could talk to some of the parents in Loudoun County, Virginia about that. Maybe you should take a look at some of the news headlines about what happens when they start putting transgender inmates into women's prisons. Wow, it's weird. The pregnancy rate suddenly went sky high, and so did sexual assaults. How did that happen? This is not to say that every kid who goes into, every person who was born a boy who now identifies as a girl and goes into the girls' restroom is going to commit sexual assault. But we're breaking down a barrier that really has no business being broken down. And the bigger question is why? Well, it's to be fair. It's to create a place of inclusivity and safety and gender neutral happiness. And no, it's not. It's a constructed reality, and we are being forced to embrace it or be considered maniacs. Actually, I think they prefer the term bigot, but those parents. And the reason that devolved into chaos at the school board meeting in Caldwell was because the school board members were shutting down discussion. Check out this headline. This is from KTVB. Caldwell School District meeting ends in chaos. Well, it did end in chaos. It's because the school board was being called out by parents who rightfully were not happy with this woke indoctrination that's being introduced into their children's lives. And the school board was having none of it. And they were manipulating the rules of the system. You can only comment if you live within this zip code. You can only comment for this long, and you can only do this. You can only do that. And then there was a state senator, and I'm terribly sorry, his name escapes me at the moment, who got up and rightly started calling them out for how they were bending and twisting the rules for their own advantage. And they adjourned the meeting. And yes, parents were rowdy. Parents were yelling. And some people may say, well, if you get rowdy, you get rude. Why? Then you have no leg to stand on. But I can promise you this. People who want to force you to accept their constructed reality are never going to allow you to politely or impolitely disagree with them. The whole idea is you cannot escape compliance with whatever the worldview, the reality is that they are telling you you must live within. Oh, and look at this. Here's some more spin from the press. This article appeared yesterday. This is on KTVB. But look, gender inclusion policies have existed in Idaho schools for years, and districts report no problems. Now, they're specifically talking about the Blaine County School District, and that Blaine County is a pretty liberal, pretty progressive district. But you think about what things were like in 2016 versus 7 years down the road and what they're like now. How many kids are being regularly promoted with the idea of, hey, you might be a different gender. What are your pronouns and so forth? It, to me, sounds like recruiting. And it sounds like introducing confusion where there was no confusion before. So they may appeal to, but they've had this policy and it's really never been an issue. Well, how many kids have you had that have been demanding, I need to use the girls' restroom or the girls' locker room, even though I was born a boy? It's the introduction of confusion and chaos and, frankly, a blatant disconnect from reality, and everybody is expected to go along with it. How is this a good idea? And how does this serve the purpose of what these school districts exist for in the first place, which I was told are to educate Idaho's kids. In fact, I think Governor Little talked about that is the key to a safe and happy future, is a proper education. This is indoctrination. This is not education. But if you call it such, you're going to be, considered a hateful person. Oh, and look at this, right on cue. Here's one from, this is, I believe, from the Idaho Capital Sun. Public invited to a meeting of United Against Hate Initiative. That's coming up January 16th in Caldwell. Well, it sounds like they need it. After all, there were parents who were opposed to these LGBTQ rights policies. Of course they're opposed. It's their kids. They don't want their kids being taken for a ride, and rightly so. They shouldn't. So this is a quote from the U.S. attorney who puts on these workshops. In my view, this initiative is particularly timely for Idaho. Let me translate what that means. You bigots need to learn what to think, and quick, as we have experienced a series of troubling hate incidents throughout the state in the past several years. By the way, the hate incidents he talks about were actual crimes where someone may or may not have used racial slurs, but the crimes themselves were the actual crime, not what the person was thinking. Josh Hurd in his office's news release announced the event. As Attorney General Merrick Garland has said, this is a moment for an all-hands-on-deck approach to combating unlawful hate. There it is again. In this constructed reality in which only the government can fix the problem of unlawful hate, what on earth is unlawful hate? In fact, for that matter, tell me, what is lawful hate? Is lawful hate the kind that's directed at people who wear MAGA hats? People who question whether the election results really were on the up and up? People who still, say the Pledge of Allegiance? People who still pray over their food before they eat? What is lawful hate versus unlawful hate? More buzzwords than a beehive here. I mean, come on. This is constructed reality being forced down our throats. Now let's take a little bit deeper dive into the whole idea of constructed reality. This is from Paul Rosenberg. He notes, first and foremost, life spawns chosen, decentralized, and organic organization. In other words, left to our own devices, that's how we live. That's what a free, productive, innovative life would look like. Chosen, decentralized, organic organizations. You will not be associating with somebody just because, you'd be a bad person not to. You associate with people that you voluntarily want to choose to associate with and help. And there's no hate involved. This is just people exercising their volition to associate with whom they wish to associate with, to create as they wish to create. He says the people and organizations that oppose that require our constraint. They require our automatic compliance, and they couldn't survive any other way. This is one of the reasons why school choice represents such a threat to them. What better way to indoctrinate children into that constructed reality? He says the model of the dogmatists, rulers, think tanks, and other lords of the constructed reality require enforced grouping. They forbid by any number of means alternatives to themselves. What does forced grouping look like? Boys using your daughter's bathroom at school or locker room at school, or girls likewise. Look, nobody's trying to make anybody else's life harder, but why do we impose the greatest imposition on the majority, on the rule, and cater to the exception? I mean, it could be simply handled with, private unisex bathrooms. They usually have those anyway. Sometimes we call them handicapped bathrooms. I don't know if that's politically incorrect, but, there are alternatives. But that enforced grouping, that's an important part because we have to submit. Paul Rosenberg goes on to say, the lords of constructed reality then cannot allow life, or those of us living our lives, to break out of its constraints. And they fear the recognition of an objective standard. Male, female, right, wrong, proper, improper, natural, unnatural, normal, deviant. They fear that recognition because it would wipe away their intellectual sandcastles and make auto-compliance nearly impossible. He says that fact should condemn them right off, except that most people have been confused and conditioned otherwise. They've been taught by the constructed reality that the constructed reality is the only reality and that advocates for anything else are maniacs. I think the preferred nomenclature that the press likes to use, at least here in Idaho, is extremists, far-right extremists, because they cling to reality. They cling to their guns and their Bibles. But I'm telling you, the reality that we're being offered is not the kind of reality that I would think any of us would willingly walk into if we understand that we have alternatives, or if we actually can see those alternatives. So what's the solution? Well, here's how Paul Rosenberg describes it. He says, what we're doing then is building a chosen society centered on the golden rule. You understand what the golden rule is, right? Don't do to other people what you wouldn't want done to yourself. It's the model of the healthy family, the productive small business, and so on. Our way is the better way, the way that takes life as an absolute standard. Now, it's interesting. Specifically, he's talking about how life itself is proof that absolutes do exist. And basically, he's saying, anybody who says that they're not pro-life, if they push back against pro-life advocacy, and frankly, we've had a lot of that here in Idaho since the trigger law went into effect following the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe v. Wade. But he says, those people betray the fact that, well, if you're so against the whole pro-life movement, why do you take antibiotics? Right? You do it to preserve your life. And he says that's the natural order. Every living organism does what it can to protect life, to protect its own life. And when we're dealing with innocent life, that's sometimes, at least in the case of human innocent life, there's a point where that baby's not able, that fetus isn't able to assert itself. So then it's on us to protect it. But the alternative is the constructed reality in which, it's just some obligate parasite, it's just a clump of cells or whatever. But people who don't care for life, people who don't care for reality, want us to believe that the constructed reality, and it's a politically correct reality, it's much more of the dogma of a religious movement than not. That's the only reality that we're supposed to be able to acknowledge. And if you don't, and frankly, I'm going to stick up for Governor Little just a bit here. I don't think he is a rabid wokester by any stretch of the imagination, but he strikes me as scared to death of the woke crowd. Like, he really appears to be afraid of, I don't want to offend anybody. An even better example of this, if you can dare to watch it, is Utah's Governor Spencer Cox. Holy cow, talk about abasing yourself, trying to gain the approval of the people who are trying to force you into their constructed reality. That's a no-win game. So, treat people the way that you would want to be treated. That's the golden rule. That's the best possible way. Doesn't matter your belief system, doesn't matter if you're religious or not. If you would do unto others the way you would have others do unto you, you're not going to go far wrong. But especially when you start to try to harness the power of government to fleece other people of their money and use it to fund things that are offensive to them, or to force their kids into arrangements or groupings that don't even comport with reality, you're treading on thin ice. And you shouldn't be surprised when people get upset, especially when their concerns fall on ears that are tone deaf and can only hear the cries of the wokesters and the need to be inclusive and create that safe environment. How about you focus on doing your jobs? How about you focus on teaching kids the skills that they need to get out there and live productive lives, instead of trying to make sure that everybody has correct attitudes? What if we tried that for a change? See, I fear that we're reaching a point where the only alternative for people is going to be, if school choice is an impossibility, if the political machine does its best to keep us away from anything that would offer us an alternative to its constructed reality, then parents are going to have no choice but to pull their kids out of school. And there will reach a point where that gets big enough that it's going to be an emergency. Be interesting to see that happen. I would hate to see it come to that. But what choice are you going to have? Parents, you're going to find out soon just how serious you are about protecting your kids. That's a lot to cover. It's a lot to think about. But by gosh, that's why I'm here. And where there's media bias, I will find it and I will share it with you and hopefully offer you another alternative to consider. This is Nowhere to Hide. Thanks for watching.
Are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how